So we left off last time on the sprint model of meetings and agile methodology more generally. So this is our figure of the sprint in agile. And remember, we talked about that. We have all these things that need to happen within the context of the sprint, and they all have to be done successfully in order to have a successful sprint. And that sprints are tied back to hackathons and dockathons, that they both have this sort of accelerated pace of development or of work. Hackathon is really specialized for innovation. Dockathon is specialized for building infrastructure or maintenance. An ideathon is for generating ideas. And the sprint, of course, is to take like a workflow that you're working on or a set of issues. Remember, we talked about how you build from the first few issues and you try to get work out a good enough solution so that you can demo that solution in front of your team. Your team gives you feedback, and then they help you kind of iteratively perfect the thing that you're trying to do. And of course, the sprint is a means to take those backlog items, those items that are maybe long suffering or hard to really address in the normal course of your work, and work on those in an accelerated period of work. So we need a project vision, of course. We need a sprint planning to go well. We need then to have our implementation go well. We need to have our daily scrum, which is where we meet daily and talk about what we've done and what we haven't been able to do. We need that to go well. We need our sprint review to go well. So immediately reviewing what we did. And then the retrospective, which is a deeper sort of dive into our sprint and putting it in the context of our larger project. And we need that to go well as in addition to that. So the point of this is that any one failure point in this process can derail the entire sprint or maybe sometimes the entire project. So the sprint model might be good for teams that work fast. They need to have a fast response. They need to have this sort of constant feedback. We talked about an agile where you're doing a lot of lean documentation. So you're not doing documentation. You're spending your time on communication. You're spending your time on prioritization. You're spending your time on thinking about, specific tasks. You're not working from specs like you are in waterfall. So, again, that's great. And sprints are, kind of a way out of the stodginess of waterfall. That is to say, doesn't rely on these highly constraining specs. We can do things, we can actually be pretty flexible in our sprint, but a lot of the pieces need to be there. And if they break down, if communication breaks down in the scrum, if your review is insufficient, if you don't have anyone to do that review or that retrospective, or if your project vision isn't very good, or if your planning for the sprint isn't very good, all those things can introduce problems that can derail something like a sprint, and in fact sometimes derail your project. So you might think that this is a little bit too brittle of a model, that you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants. But the alternative, of course, is to work from specs or to work slower and maybe less effectively. So this is a type of public event. This brings us to what we call failure modes of public events. So when I say failure modes, I mean, I've told you about these public events, the hackathons, the dockathons, the sprints, and I've given you sort of this royal road treatment, right? It's like I'm telling you how to do this, how to make this perfect, how to make this work well. But in fact, there are a lot of failures that can happen. And those failures, you need to be able to identify those failures so you don't fall into these traps, because sometimes you may do everything right on the side of infrastructure. You may actually get all of the points in the sprint right. You might have a very good vision, you might have very good planning, good communication on the team, maybe not, we'll talk about that. And then a good retrospective and review, and still not do well in terms of your sprint. And so why would that be? So this is a post from social media. These pictures in black with the white text, those will be like posts from social media. And I'll talk about this person, their sort of reflections, and then I'll tell you why that's important. So Michael McClimate says, I spent some time this weekend thinking about meetings and their content as artifacts within our organizations and work systems. So when I say artifacts, I mean that they are things that first of all, our project, and I focused on a lot of diagrams. I focused on a lot of sort of complexity. And those, I'm trying to get you to think eventually of projects as a system. So a system is where you have a lot of interacting parts, you have inputs and outputs, you have a lot of complexity that you have to manage. And you have to identify the things that are sort of like if you have a piece of communication, what is that? It's an artifact that you share with some other team member. Or, if you have some documentation, that's an artifact that you share with other team members, sometimes asynchronously. And so you have to think about how meetings and their content are similarly artifacts within our organizational work systems. So that means that they're subject to these sort of cultural, these cultural attitudes. They're subject to the relative sort of function or dysfunction of your team and your organization. So these meetings, they may seem trivial, but they carry a lot of sort of diagnostic power as to how well your organization is working, how well your communication systems are working, how well these artifacts hold interest and meaning for people in the team. So then he says, okay, there are artifacts of organizations and work systems, and what types of affordances they provide for the participants. So the word affordances is interesting because if you've taken in the iSchool, if you've taken any UX UI, or you've taken any HCI, human computer interaction, you may have heard of affordances as being these things that help people interact with the world. So if there's a door handle on the door, I know kind of whether I need to twist that or push it to open the door. It's a symbol that I use, and it gives me the sort of feedback I need to make the right decision. I don't want to stand by the door and pound on it. That doesn't work. So the affordances help you navigate the system. And so what he's saying is that meetings and their content, if done well, are artifacts, but also affordances that help you navigate your organization. And if they're not that sort of thing, if they don't have those affordances built in, then they're not very useful, and people don't necessarily respond well to them. Okay, so then, and for the people who aren't there but are affected by the decisions made in them. So, you have a meeting, we might have a sprint, we might do things in a sprint, we might have a fabulous sprint. But then there are other members in other teams that are affected by what we do during the sprint. So maybe the sprint was optimal for us, but it wasn't very optimal for other members of other teams because it was uncoordinated with what they're doing in their teams. And so the program manager now has a problem where you're out of sync with your team is out of sync with the other teams or the other projects. So then he continues the mechanisms and conditions framework that Jenny L. Davis develops in how artifacts afford is helpful for understanding them and how they may feel for some people involved. So this is a book, I believe, How Artifacts Afford by Jenny L. Davis. And this kind of talks about these kind of meetings and public events as sort of, has to be useful for people. So sometimes you have meetings that are great for some people, but not for other people. Sometimes, and maybe you've done this, so I'll give an example. Let's say we had a room full of people, and I wanted to do a software demo, and I wanted you to follow along on your laptops. and I wanted you to install some software to do some exercises. Those exercises require you to successfully install the software and to know how to use the software at a high level. So a lot of times in teams, of course, we talked about level of technical competence. Some people have a high level of technical competence, but some people don't. If you have people on your team that are programmers, and then you have people on your team who are doing things like design or other types of roles, they may or may not be able to keep up. And if we switch to some sort of design oriented activity, it might be the same thing for the programmers. They might fall behind. So we don't want to have a meeting where we rely on a high bar or high barrier to competence. We want to figure out for our team what the right level of competence is, what the right level of work is. If we go through a sprint, we don't want to assign 100 issues to every person in the team because you'd never get through all of them in your sprint. And if you did, they would be of poor quality. If we have a hackathon, we don't want to just kind of let people do whatever they want or, leave some of the technical support until the hackathon itself. So, I might host a hackathon and I might say, we're going to use the supercomputer cluster and I want you to install some software to get yourself connected and learn how to use it. But we're going to do that during the hackathon itself, not necessarily beforehand. Well, then people waste a lot of time doing this and trying to figure out how to use things. And then by the time that's over, then your hackathon is over. So you want to make these things, easy to access for everyone involved, give them the affordances and make sure that people aren't left behind, that people aren't being failed by the meetings and public events. So public events or meetings as artifacts. This is a different way to think about public events. And when we think about them as artifacts, we think about their success, but we also think about their failure. How can they fail? How can we, make sure that they don't fail? Of course, affordances, I talked about what affordance is. In this context, affordances really are what the attendee understands and what can be successfully communicated during the event. Again, if I want to teach you how to use a piece of software, I don't want to just throw the software at you, say, install it, understand how to use it, and we'll go through these high-level tutorials. I want to make sure that your level of competence matches that. Otherwise, I may need to have the software pre-installed, talk you through some basic operations first to warm up. That way we can at least have a common framework for understanding and for getting things, moving things along. Then we have these bounded contexts. This is where we have the same words but different contexts. Sometimes this is where we have, concepts that we share with each other, but they're not, we're not thinking in the same mode. And so that can be a failure mode as well. And what I mean by that, sometimes you have, again, your different teams doing different things, your programmers, your designers, your salespeople, and they don't understand each other sometimes because they may use one word for something and another group might use another word for something else. And then it comes, then you spend a lot of time trying to parse out what people mean. Really, you want to build common ground in these public events. You don't want to rely on sort of these things that are only useful to 20 or 30% of the group in the event. You want to make sure that everyone is served and more or less equal. So Michael goes on and he says, this suggests that we may want to consider giving some distance between introducing ideas and taking actions based on them. And that this conclusion disagrees with the convention of every meeting should produce decisions that sometimes shows up. So this is an interesting point because this has a lot to do not only with our special events, but with our meetings that we use for our organization, our progress meetings, our stand-ups, and maybe even like, if we have a foundation, our board meetings. We don't need to necessarily do everything in one. So we don't need to necessarily reach some level of closure. Sometimes, if we come up with good ideas, we shouldn't make rash decisions. Other times, we don't want to kind of expect that we have the answer in one meeting or have the answer in one hackathon or in one sprint. Sometimes we need to let things go to another sprint or another hackathon or another meeting and think about what we're doing. And so we shouldn't just assume that we can just take actions or that we're compelled to take actions right away. A lot of times, like things like sprints, you want to get things done, but you also want to make sure you understand things and don't act rashly and then, make things worse for yourself later on. Sometimes, and we'll talk about hackathons, how those can be sort of, sometimes you have a nice, neat little bow at the end, a very cool demo. Sometimes you might just have to work on some idea for a while before you get there, but that's okay. As we design and adapt our work systems and when planning and running our meetings, maybe this view can help us attend to these types of effects and avoid some of the failure modes that cause meetings to be seen as wastes of time. So sometimes, we don't want our team to think meetings are a waste of time. One of those is, having like a meeting every day when you only need to have them twice a week. That can waste people's time because they're sitting in meetings the entire time and they're not getting anything done, and you're not really doing anything in these meetings. Even that actually increases the likelihood that you'll think, well, we need to make a decision in this meeting. We need to do something here, and so let's make some decisions that maybe are in our best interests. It's just there's a lot of waste in that kind of a model. Also with hackathons, if hackathons or sprints for that matter aren't very well conceived, they can end up being a waste of time. So you end up with like a hackathon where you say, well, we'll just do whatever we want to do. You can do whatever you want to do and, see where you are. And usually hackathons, we'll see this are a lot more structured than that. It's not just banging on a keyboard. You're actually doing, you're actually organizing these things at a high level. And then of course, for a sprint, you don't want to go into a sprint without adequate planning, or you don't want to go into a sprint without adequate buy-in from your team. So if your team is like, you're calling a sprint, in development, software development, sometimes people use the sprint model as a means to an end. That is, they'll do these continuous sprints. So sometimes sprints are used as like a way to finish up a release project. So you'll get about 80% of the way done, then you'll plan a sprint to finish things up. And that's, then you'll make like a release of a version of software. Sometimes people will use sprints continuously. They'll just say, we'll do a sprint, we'll see how much we get done, do another sprint, we'll keep going. And so, you have to know when you use it in two different ways like that, you have to know which way is better for your team, which one is more buy-in from your team. If your team feels like you're just sprinting constantly, and in fact, you're not getting as much done as you would think, then your team eventually views that as a waste of time and they revolt because they're not accepting this sort of work pace. Furthermore, if you have like this model where you have like a sprint at the end and you don't really complete that much work until you get to the sprint, thinking that we can leave things for the sprint, then you have a problem because people are overloaded. People are doing way too much in a sprint. And so that's another failure mode that you can have. So remember that, we might plan these public events as a manager. We might plan them as, in different roles of leadership. But the real world audience can intervene in our best intentions. So we can design the perfect event. We can do a pretty good job of planning a sprint or hackathon. But if people don't accept that, they don't work within the bounds of what we have and they're able to be productive, they don't, it's not really that good of a choice. And there are a number of failure modes there. So not every meeting or public event should produce decisions. And sometimes that's un-agile, because agile, of course, we want to be very lean, very efficient. We want to do things quickly, but sometimes we can't do things quickly. And we need to recognize that. Then rather than inefficient planning, other failure modes, lack of context, participant affordances, can result in meetings being viewed as a waste of time.